Okay, so today we're going to talk about China, but before we get into it, it's important for us to talk about the idea of imperialism at all, because there's a difference, a fundamental difference between imperialism and colonialism. And you guys have been, sort of drilled on colonialism, so I want to make sure that we get into this with the right idea. Okay, so colonialism is the practice of setting up taking a deposit of residents to leave them there so that they can grow an economic connection to a place that's already there. When you set up a colony, you move people into an area and you have them hopefully establish a foothold, establish an economic base, and grow so that they can negotiate trade with whoever else is there. Most colonies don't take place on uninhabited land, but you start with the assumption that your colony will be able to hold on to the culture from which it came and then begin to open trade with the other culture, eventually becoming more powerful than the other culture in a lot of cases. Most colonizing powers had the idea that eventually their economy would eclipse the economy of the place that they were settling into. Think about, for example, Cortez's Spanish forces and the Aztec Empire that they took over. They establish colonies inside the system and they begin to impose Spanish leadership and take it over. Okay, in Jamestown, for example, in England, that English colony of Jamestown was not set up to wipe out the indigenous people that were there. It was set up to grow to the point where they could hold their own against the indigenous people that were there and eventually become stronger than them. That's how colonialism works. Imperialism, on the other hand, is the practice of coming into a country and taking over and imposing the law and order of your own country in some ways with the plan of eradicating the identity of the people that are already there. An imperial mindset is we're going to take that place, which is valuable, and make it one of us, part of us, by imposing ourselves on it. It's much more aggressive than colonialism, and the easiest way I can find to explain is to go back to that Leviathan, that man made out of men. You remember from the cover of the book, the Leviathan? If a society is a man made out of men, right, then there are two different ways that you take over another society. One of them is the kind of the way vampires do, where you impose your society on theirs and you begin to feed off of it, but they are able to maintain their own identity. And the other one is by stripping them completely of their identity, making one of you, kind of the way zombies do, okay? So if the Leviathan, the man made out of men, wants to take over another society, there's two ways that they can do it. They can either impose their own leadership, or they can completely change the identity of the other society made out of men. So in colonialism, settlers establish an economic connection and their point is to benefit their mother country. Colonies are supposed to feed the mother country. That's what they're for. Now, there's lots of different ways that they do that. The most popular system is the mercantile system. They negotiate with the locals, but they try not to become part of the local people. They try not to introduce themselves into the culture and become part of them. And then gradually over time, they encroach on the other culture that's there. In imperialism, a sovereign state conquers the existing state and then imposes its cultural identity on it. So while Cortez's intention might have been to establish colonies, eventually with the door that he opened, the Spanish came flooding in and established land grants and encomiendas and Christian churches and took the temples that were there and made them Catholic cathedrals instead. So what happens to New Spain is more like imperialism than colonialism by the time they're done. And what happens in that setting is that the indigenous culture disintegrates and disappears. They lose their identity. So let's go back to where we left China. A while ago, when we were talking about China, we kind of left them so that we could go and deal with the Enlightenment and the Reformation and all that kind of stuff. When we left China, the Manchu had just risen up in response to the invasion of the Tokugawa Japanese that had come over the top of Korea, that had come over Korea and invaded. The rise of the warrior class of this northern people, the Manchuria, had really come into power and had kicked them back to Japan, had kicked them out of China. They still maintained a position in Korea, but they weren't coming into China anymore. In that wave of that power, the Manchu went south and began to take over all of the dynastic structures of China. And that's how we have the beginning of the Qing dynasty. That's Q-I-N-G, Qing. So the Manchu people took the royalty that was already there and rolled it in and became a new dynasty, which is the Qing dynasty, which is by far the one that Europe traded with the most. Okay, so in the 18th and 19th centuries, strong Western nations really started to dig in and spread themselves out and establish trading. And originally their intention was to build colonies in China and establish trading posts and, you know, trade with the Qing on their own ground. And the reason for that was because Europeans believed that the Qing dynasty was a mercantile dynasty. They believed that they were the same kind of colonizing power that they were. So they believed that they could have a trade negotiation with them. The problem is that the Qing were the product of a long line of invasions. Chinese dynasties are used to being invaded. And what happens when a new dynasty comes in and invades and kicks the old dynasty out is the entire country adjusts. That's what happens. So when the English begin to really arrive and start negotiating the trade, the Qing don't treat them like an equal power that wants to invade. They treat them like a people that wants to come and be folded in. Remember way back when Genghis Khan was rolling over the countryside and taking over all of Asia? Do y'all remember way back then? And he appointed Kublai Khan to take over China, and Kublai Khan became a part of the Chinese culture. By adopting some of their practices, he adopted Confucianism, he adopted Buddhism. That's what they're used to in an invader. So when the English arrived, they're like, oh, you want to become Chinese? Well, we're always happy when new people want to become Chinese. Welcome to our country. Move on in. Here's how we do things. Oh, you have
it didn't work that way.
Too. Yeah, no. You do. You have different things that you do too. Okay, well, we'll make those part of our culture too. See, that's how they fold together. That's the way China had always dealt with invaders before. The problem is that there's a big trade imbalance between the English and the Chinese. All the European powers really and the Chinese, and that is China has things that Europe wants, and Europe has nothing that China wants. So they set up there's a massive trade imbalance right from the beginning because China has all of the trading power. Everything that they want, silk and all of these products that they have, tea, oh my gosh, the tea. Yeah, see, tea, oh my God, tea. So they set up what are called factories, and factories are not what you think of as factories. They're not places where you manufacture things. They are trading hubs where the European powers are allowed to come and trade. And they're port cities often, and they're places where the Europeans can come and set up trade negotiations and barter for products. They really wish that they could get further into the countryside, but the Chinese really only let them in as far as these trading hubs because the rural countryside of China is hard to navigate anyway. So the Chinese had no particular reason to barter with the English because they didn't have anything that the English didn't have anything the Chinese wanted, and the English wanted everything the Chinese had. At this point in European history, the entire continent of Europe is so badly addicted to tea that they literally can't live without it. And I think that's funny because I'm like, well, that's ridiculous as I sip my coffee, you know, as I deal with my own addictions. So at the same time that this was happening, that Europe had this, you know, utter complete dependence on Chinese products, the crystal and the china and the silk and the tea. They were also introducing a new product into their own society, which was opium. The British East India Company had opened a cash crop colony outside of Bengal to grow medicinal opium. And that cash crop colony, like their cash crop colonies in North America, was utterly dependent on England for their other products, but was shipping out opium in large amounts, poppies and opium in large amounts. Smugglers found a way to take the opium from these cash crop colonies and move them into the countryside of China. These remote Chinese islands here. And then once they were on the islands, they managed to find middlemen to smuggle that opium into the mainland and sell it kind of in the countryside, not in the major cities, but in the countryside. So the opium addiction spread from the English cash cow colonies into the Chinese islands, and then into the Chinese rural area, and then into the cities. And by the time it got to the cities and got to the attention of the Chinese authorities, the entire country was hooked on opium. So the Chinese had to set up a minister whose specific job was to shut down the opium trade, and his name was Lin Zexu. I always say these things wrong, but his whole job was to stop the opium trade. And he did it in probably the most ineffective way possible. He blockaded the ports and seized the opium, 20,000 chests of opium, and dumped them, destroyed them. This is not something the British are going to be happy about, because even though it was smugglers that were doing it, it was still British property that they were using to do it. So 20,000 chests of opium, that's kind of like, I don't know, several $1 million, I guess. They were forced to sign a pledge never to sell the stuff again, and forced to leave the trading factories. The British sent ships to demand compensation for this loss. They sent ships to demand compensation. And that led to a bloody attack on Canton, which was one of the biggest trading ports. So the British surrounded Canton with their official military, even though it was smugglers that had been bringing it in to begin with. It was the official, actual military. But you have to remember the British East India Company at this time had its own military. They had 67,000 troops of their own. So, and most of those holders of the East India Company were also members of the British government. So to say, well, it was the smugglers who did it, but then it was the British military that came and demanded compensation. They're all connected. They're all part of the same structure. The same nobles who have holdings in the East India Company also have seats in Parliament, you know. So it's all part of the same structure. But it was a great opportunity for the English to finally shift the balance of trade in their favor, because the entire country is now hooked on opium. So they have something now that they can trade that is as valuable as every single one of those bits of tea that they've been craving all this time. Because the Chinese lose this battle, they end up having to sign a treaty with the British that gives them all kinds of power, the Treaty of Nanking or Nanjing. And this allows British ships to occupy the ports, the British to open embassy on the land. It makes it so that the British citizens who get arrested can only be tried by the British consulate. So if they commit a crime against the Chinese can't try them for that crime. They can only be tried by British authorities. That seems fair. And by the way, all of the cost of the Opium War, China has to pay it back. And they can pay it back in tea, but they have to pay it back. So the balance of trade completely shifts as a result of the British hooking the entire country on opium. When France and the US hear about this, they begin to petition. Yes? I heard it. Lisa, I can hear that you're talking, but I can't hear what you're saying.
She said she no, I said, excuse me, I just cleared my throat.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I'm like, I hear a voice. Yeah, I love Zoom. All right, so when France and the US hear that the British have gotten this great deal, they petition to the Chinese government to get the same deal, that they should be also allowed to have that. And so China is forced to make a similar treaty with France and the US. It's called the Most Favored Nation Treaty. And it basically means that if they make a treaty with any of these nations, it automatically applies to the other ones too. So now France also gets to occupy the ports. The US also gets extraterritoriality. They also can't get tried by the Chinese for crimes that they commit. It's a really bad deal for the Chinese. One of the things that happens is that the trade ports move. They move further north, out of the port cities of the south and further north. And as a result of that, certain smaller producers of goods in the south lose a lot of their business and become really, really agitated. So there are protests and rebellions. The South rebels in 1851, and 30 million people are killed in this rebellion. So it's technically the largest civil war in the world, because the south of China rebels against the north of China for moving their trading ports, and over 30 million people are killed. Part of that is led by this gentleman here, whose name I'm going to try to pronounce. I think it's Shukan, but I'm not positive about that. I think it's got like more syllables than that. But this particular man believed that, he failed the Confucian examination. And when he failed it, all of that pressure that was on him to pass that examination caused him to have a nervous breakdown. In the midst of his nervous breakdown, while he was basically unconscious and disassociated, he had a vision of the movement of Christianity in China to create a heaven and earth, a heaven on earth, using him, the brother of Christ, who he believed he actually was, Jesus Christ's brother, like born and reincarnated. So it was called the Heavenly Kingdom of Great Peace. And he gathered followers behind him on the promise that he was the new brother of Jesus Christ, and that therefore if they followed him, that they would be successful in overtaking all of China and then building a Christian empire in China. Mostly the people that gathered around him were people on the fringe, people that didn't like what had happened in the trading empires, people that couldn't reconcile themselves to European powers. What they ended up with was kind of a mishmash of Protestant, Christian, and animistic pre-Confucian beliefs. So they were like Protestant Christian, but with some of the ritualistic, animistic, ancestral worship kind of pieces of what had existed in China before Confucius got there. So they end up with this completely new flavor of Christianity. And then they gather an army and attack Beijing and attack the royalty in Beijing. They very nearly managed to drive the Qing out of Beijing. They managed almost to be successful. They managed to push into the urban centers, but then the thing is that all of the treaties that Europe has negotiated have been with the Qing, has been with the dynasty that's in charge. So when this rebellion comes over the hillside, even though they have a flavor of Christianity that they're bringing with them, they can't make alliances with the US or with Europe or with France, because the US and France and England already have alliances with the royalty of the Qing. So the Qing managed to put down this rebellion and drive them out of the cities. But the Taiping actually still live in all of the rural areas and are just waiting, and crouched and ready for the next time that they're going to rise. In the middle of all of this, in the middle of this Taiping rebellion, the Qing lose a lot of their autonomy and they lose a lot of their power because a rebellion very nearly kicked them out of their own cities. But in the middle of all of this, a new emperor is born. And he's like, ascends to become the emperor when he's 4 years old. His parents die. But he's got this aunt, you see. And this aunt is extremely power hungry and extremely dedicated to building the dynasty for her nephew, so that he can have an empire when he actually becomes an adult. So she's fiercely protective of the dynasty, and she begins to negotiate putting down the rebellion and making alliances. One of the ways that they do that is by introducing the idea of self-strengthening. Okay, so if you are a nation or a country or a society that is used to having invaders come in and tell you how to do things, you're used to that. Invaders come in and they tell you all the newest technologies come into your country through other parties, other invasions that come in. Technology comes up the Silk Road and into your, China is responsible for inventing so many technologies, but warfare is something that they are taught by interactions on the Silk Road. So they have relied on the outside foreign powers for their own military strategies ever since the beginning. They've always done that. But that is not serving them well at the moment. So the idea is to take all of the technologies that they have from all these foreign nations, the French, and take all the best of them and then purposefully build themselves into a stronger military. That's the idea. Okay, we've got people that are coming in with rifled muskets. Let's figure out how those work and make them part of our military so that the Chinese can be more powerful. We've got people coming in with explosives and being used in a different way that we ever use them, no problem. We'll make them part of our military. We've got people who are training in a different way. You know, we've got people that are training to be, you know, infantry in a modern military, modern for like the 1800s, in a modern military, instead of training to be, you know, hand-to-hand combat fighters. Let's go ahead and let's embrace that. The problem is, so phase one of the self-strengthening movement from 1861 to 1872 is to take Western firearms, Western machines, scientific knowledge, and bring in train technical and diplomatic personnel by establishing colleges. Make colleges whose job it is to actually train personnel, not just in warfare, but in diplomacy. Learn all of the theories that are coming out of Paris and all the theories that are coming out of London, and figure out how to interact with these people on their own ground. That's phase one. Phase two, after the riots in 1871, after the Taiping Rebellion, is to reform commerce, industry, and agriculture. Modernize things, westernize things, make things productive, go into those cash crop colonies that seem to be working so well for so many other people. You know, figure out how to update everything so that China is more directly productive instead of just relying on it to continue to produce the goods that it has. And phase three is the creation of a military structure, a Navy board, a military, you know, they need their own chiefs of staff, they need their own joint chiefs, I guess. They need their own people to be in charge of different branches of the military, and reduce government interference in the big industries. Let industry executives take over, and actually entrepreneurs actually take over. That's the idea. These are the phases the way they're supposed to work, okay? This was the idea put out by the Dowager Empress and then carried out by her government. Y'all got this pretty much? Okay. Unfortunately, at the same time that that's happening, that they're doing self-strengthening, all of these powers are really, really kicking into gear with their Asian colonies. So we've got the British who have already taken over most of the subcontinent, and are now planning. I mean, this is Singapore. These are places where the British have really established themselves. The Dutch East India Company established its own trading ports and grew this place. And now France has started getting into this part of Asia. They've gotten into what is going to be Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos. And they've started establishing colonies. And I have to say the French ones are weird. It's almost like when you look at what you find in South Asia, it's almost like
Thailand was never colonized. Sorry.
I didn't catch that. Thailand was never colonized, is what she said.
Yeah.
Okay. But it almost seems like when you're looking at the Southeast Asian French holdings, it almost was like they wanted a playground. Like they wanted a place to go visit. Like they wanted the crops that they grew there. They wanted the cash crop colonies, but they also they wanted a place that would stay quaint so that they could visit it, you know? So what you end up with are major cities on the borders here that are very French, very, very French. And then out in the countryside, you end up with little colonies where the urban French people who live in the cities can go visit and pretend like they're peasants again, but like they're surrounded by peasants again. They're really weird. I mean, really, it seems like something that France would do, you know? But when you look at the way that their colonies are run, they're obviously not trying to modernize them or westernize them. It's like French city, completely peasant or rural areas. But they are encroaching on Chinese space, and they are establishing themselves as a power. So China decides that it really needs to get a hold of using these self-strengthening. It needs to really take this new military out and see what it can do. So it looks at the most likely target for their own colonizing exploits, for their own attempts to establish their expansion as power. And where do you think they go? Anybody want to guess? What would be the most logical place to go? Nobody wants to guess? Korea. Korea has always been back and forth between the Japanese and the Chinese and the Russians and the Chinese. It's always been the place where these things start. So if they want to take their military out and take it for a test run, the place to do that is the Korean Peninsula. So they take what they believe to be a newly self-strengthened military out, and they use it against the Japanese on the Korean Peninsula. This is where they find out what has been wrong with their self-strengthening technique. First of all, the self-strengthening technique has been patchy and haphazard. It's not happened overall. It's been a great idea, but the implementation of it hasn't been very good. Part of that is because they put in railroads and they put in telegraphs, and they do have more modern weapons, but the soldiers that are using those weapons don't have the training to actually figure out the best way to use them. In order to be trained, they have to bring experts in from outside, and those experts from outside don't have a very good motivation for training them. I mean, what's the upside for being a European military trainer who comes in and trains the Chinese how to fight? What's your upside? A really strong Chinese military? Is that really what we want? So, and the other thing is that the people that they put in charge of this are the nobles. The Qing nobility is put in charge of carrying out the self-strengthening. They're given the job of making their peasants stronger military people. And I don't know how to put this nicely, but they just don't want to. They're just like lazy about it. They're just not as interested. They like the traditional way of doing things. So the soldiers are from the peasant population. They're untrained. They have new weapons that they're not very good at using. And their officers are nobility who have no interest in actually, maintaining their military. So this is where we find out that a lot of these self-strengthening reforms didn't really work. They may have reformed the military, they may have reformed the weapons, but their peasants are still starving to death. So they're nobility.
Hey, Mindy,
Yes.
The Last Samurai, the movie, it gives you a good example of the Chinese troops at that time.
Does it?
Yes.
I thought The Last Samurai was in Japan.
It was what?
I thought The Last Samurai took place in Japan.
Yeah, I guess, yeah, you're right. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, it's no problem. But you bring up an interesting point, because the Japanese also will instill a self-strengthening technique, and theirs will be different. And you just demonstrated exactly why. So I'm glad that you brought it up, because we're going to come back to that on Thursday when we talk about how Japan tried to do this and they did it a completely different way. So good job. But yeah, the whole idea of trying to make a military behave like the Western militaries without providing them with the training and without acknowledging that they come from different roots, and putting it in the hands of nobles who have always just kind of leaned on the peasants without actually providing them with anything. I mean, the nobles have never been, it's never been the kind of system where nobles took care of their peasants. So why would they start now? So they have their butts whooped by the Japanese, and find out very quickly that they don't have the military they thought they had. They took their military out for a drive and it crashed, basically. And now they are subject to everyone else. Okay, so tell me what you see in this picture. Just take a look at it for a minute and tell me what you see.
Russia, Austria.
Oh, China's the dragon.
Right, China is the dragon and it is on the ground. So who is this? Every country has a representative animal. We have animals that we use to represent every country.
That has to be America.
Which one?
England.
Which one has to be America?
Oh, the lion?
No, the lion is England. England is always a lion.
Oh, I was thinking of the
This is America. It's a bald eagle.
Yeah, the bear is Russia.
The bear is Russia. That's right. Okay, we see Germany. Where's Germany? Up at the top? Yep. This is, what is this? Anybody in my, that ever took 1301 with me, what is this?
The rooster is France.
The rooster is France. Yes, the rooster is always France.
Is that a vulture?
Yes.
Is that Austria?
And then this, I'm interested to find out who y'all think this is.
I feel like that's the privateers.
It's Spain.
It's very, very, very faint, but it's on his hat right here. It says Italy on his hat. So
Oh.
Italy is apparently, I don't know, a wolf or
Yeah,
something?
Rome.
I'm not sure.
Rome.
Japan is down here. So basically this picture demonstrates exactly what happened to China after that. When they took their military out, their self-strengthened military out for a drive and found out that it wasn't worth very much, that it wasn't actually very effective, they became prey to the entire rest of the world. Now is the time to move in and establish a power center in China because China is weak. And you can tell which era in Chinese history this is because it's got the Manchurian Q It's got the Manchu Q, the Qing Q haircut. Essentially, so many countries descend on China all at the same time, the negotiating between them becomes really messy. And it's actually a US representative, the Secretary of State, John Jay, who, by the way, has also just, who negotiates several other treaties throughout his life. But the Secretary of State, John Jay, introduces what's called the open door policy, which means that nobody should be allowed to monopolize trade in China. If this is what we have right now, this is what we should always have. We should always be able to all get to China. We should all be able to trade in and out of China. And the Chinese don't really need to have any authority here. So if France or England finds an advantage trading in China, everybody should be able to exploit that. Everybody should be able to. That's the open door policy that's negotiated by the US on behalf of China. And he does it in kind of a weird way. If you actually read his documentation, it's like, in order to maintain the peace for the Chinese peasant, let's not have war on their territory. Let's just all enjoy it. That sounds fine, right? Does that sound legit? That's the open door policy in a nutshell. Was supposed to promote peace in China and make all of Chinese, production and trade and manufacturing available to the rest of the world.
It's pretty easy to see where bitterness comes from.
Say again?
It's pretty easy to see where all the bitterness comes from.
You think they'd be bitter about that? I don't know. You think that there would be some resentment amongst the Chinese people that this was what happened? I don't know why. I mean, it's just to promote peace. It's just to make them productive members of the West, right? And eventually, the fact that they lose their entire identity in the process, that's not so bad. So obviously there is a rebellion after this policy happens. It starts, oddly enough, when German missionaries start using the open door policy to start moving church people in the north. That's actually how it starts. Rebellions against the German missionaries, but it spreads so fast across the entire countryside. And at this point, the Qing dynasty is even like, this is ridiculous. We've been completely taken advantage of. We're completely at the mercy of all of these other powers. That the Qing dynasty actually allies with the rebels. The rebels, they are the Society of the Harmonious Fists, and that's a translation in English, so it's probably wrong, but the context of that is something that we don't really have, the Harmonious Fists. But we do know that because they tended to use martial arts in their fighting, they were referred to by the English as boxers. So this is the Boxer Rebellion. This is the uprising of rural people who worked and lived and moved in and out of the urban areas, who are fed up with European powers moving in on their territory. They start by rebelling against German missionaries, but they very quickly move into all the trading ports in all of the cities. And especially when the Dowager Empress rallies behind them and says that the Qing will join forces with the Society of Harmonious Fists, with the Boxers, to overthrow the European powers and kick them out of the country. So there's a massive rebellion, the Boxer Rebellion. And in this massive rebellion, they demand, the Germans demand that the Qing dynasty pay reparations for the damage that they took from this rebellion, and that's what makes the Qing dynasty decide to ally with the rebellion. They don't want to pay reparations for something that, the Germans kind of brought on themselves. So the German, the British, the Japanese, and the Russians all form a coalition to push the rebellion and the Dowager Empress and the Qing dynasty out of the capital. So every time that we see a rebellion uprise, we see the forces coalesce against it and push it down and gain more territory. During the Taiping Rebellion, the Qing actually called on European help to put that rebellion down. And that opened the door for them to negotiate more trading powers and more treaties. Now the Qing are allying with the rebels, and now Europe has the power to push them out of power completely. So the end of this is a very bloody uprising that basically results in massive evacuations of European people. There are people who fled the Boxer Rebellion who actually have, within living memory of their families, fleeing the Boxer Rebellion as part of their lives. But by 1900, they've been pushed back out. And the Boxer Rebellion results in China has to pay a huge debt and actually has to borrow money from Europe to pay back Europe for the damage that they did. They actually have to borrow money from Europe in order to pay reparations to Europe.
So if you use credit card to pay off a bank loan.
Yes, yeah, except with, blood and death. It allows Britain to put a military presence in every city. So remember, they had 13 trading cities at the beginning. Now they have a military presence in every city in China, and also places in the rural countryside where they can move. In every one of those cities, if there is a difference of opinion between a Chinese law and a British law, the British law wins. And upper class Chinese are encouraged from that point on to learn English, because they're not going to survive otherwise. You're not going to be able to continue to negotiate unless you learn English. So what we have here is an uprising and a push, and an uprising and a push, and then gradually by the end of this, what we have is a China in which Chinese customs and cultures are actually a deficit, actually cause you to be further behind. And
the Ip Man movies are actually really good examples of this.
the what?
The Ip Man movies.
Okay, I don't think I've ever heard of those.
He was the martial artist that trained Bruce Lee, but they made a massive amount of movies about him because
Can you
his life
spell
was
it or something?
1900.
E-M-A-N.
Ip Man. Okay, the Ip Man movies. All right, cool.
Yeah, there's like 5 of them.
Okay.
So it's
The
pretty
best
much
was-
at the time that the British moved in, and then to the end.
Okay, so I want to have to go back, and you're going to have to dig back a long way for this because we've had a lot of isms since we talked about this. But remember that back in the beginning, when we left China, they had made a decision to open trade at the same time that Japan had made a decision to close trade. Y'all remember we talked about this back here. This slide was also in the other presentation. At the time when we talked about it, most of the class said that that was the best thing that they could do. That opening themselves to trade was smarter than closing all of their borders and closing everything off. So what do y'all think now? I'm just curious. I wasn't trying to make a point or anything. I'm just curious if you understand the trend and exactly the way it happened. What are your all's thoughts?
The rest of the countries are selfish,
Well, they're expansionists.
but they have so much land already. Why do they have to take more?
That's a good
For
question.
selfish reasons.
Okay, I don't think it's the land they want, it's the product. For the most part, I don't think that the English colonizing efforts are to gain land, they're to gain cash crop colonies. They're to gain crops and
Probably
products.
done it in a better way.
Probably, but
Back with East India though, doesn't it?
yeah. The establishment of the East India Company colonies in Britain were specifically designed to grow and expand and take control of Indian trade. So, yeah, that's definitely true. Okay, but let me ask you something. What is it do you think makes European powers feel that they have the right to do this? What do you think it is that makes European powers feel
They're
like it would be better for China to be under the power of European
Religion.
religion?
Yeah,
Is
the
a big
civilized
part of
life,
it. Religion is a big part of it, but it's not the only part.
Manifest destiny.
Yeah, like an itch there, Chris,
Because they're white.
because they're white, yeah. Naturally superior because of their race. An interesting thought. Where would an idea like that come from, I wonder? Anybody in here that was also in my World Civ 1 class? Where would an idea like your race is superior come from in Europe?
I know what you're talking about, but I can't remember the word.
Okay. All right, let me know if you come up with it. Okay, so we don't know. We'd have to speculate a lot in order to
So
come up
it
with.
has to, maybe like because Egypt, the Egyptians felt that they were better than the Jews, so they enslaved the Jews.
Okay, so basic feeling of superiority makes it okay for you to come in and impose your will on an inferior group.
I'm not saying it's okay, but it would be an idea that they could have gotten.
But what's interesting is that if you look at all of the advancements that are made in European cultures, they're only made because of advancements that were made in China first.
You
I don't
mean
know.
like
It's interesting to me. Okay, so that's really all I've got, and it's about 9 o'clock now. So I'm gonna turn it back over to talking about your papers. We have a lot of interactions that are happening here in this particular, we have a lot of interactions when we talk about colonialism. Is anybody struggling with finding what interaction you're going to talk about with your country? I know that we've had a couple of people that were like, my country is just, it's just the country. It's just a country. They don't interact with other people. Is anybody actually struggling with that, or have y'all all pretty much got it picked out? I'm here to help you. We're here to help each other. It's okay to admit that you haven't looked at it yet. No judgment. Okay. How about y'all in Zoom? Anybody having trouble with figuring out what country they're going to interact with? The dead silence is really, really making me feel good about this situation.